Boa tarde a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindas e bem-vindos a esse evento da segunda Vice-Presidência do NUPEMEC, do Tribunal de Justiça do Estado do Paraná e do Consulado Geral do Canadá, esse webinário internacional que nos enche de alegria e que nos faz celebrar essa amizade entre esses dois países e essa parceria que vem rendendo frutos para a Justiça Restaurativa. Meu nome é Larissa Angélica Copac Muniz, eu sou juíza de Direito, coordenadora estadual do Comitê de Justiça Restaurativa do NUPEMEC, e vou apresentar a vocês as pessoas que hoje farão parte desse evento, agradecendo, primeiramente, a cônsul-geral, a doutora Heather, pela acolhida da ideia de trazer dois especialistas em trabalhos com vítimas em justiça restaurativa, e também agradecendo imensamente a desembargadora Justiça Machado Camargo por ter permitido que esse evento se desenvolvesse também em parceria com o NUPEMEC, que é um núcleo de autocomposição do nosso tribunal. E o Paraná ele vem ocupando um lugar de destaque na justiça restaurativa nacionalmente, e são movimentos como esse que nos encorajam e nos trazem a certeza de que a justiça do século XXI veio para ficar no nosso estado e também no nosso país. Gostaria agora de conceder a palavra à desembargadora Justiça Machado Camargo para a abertura dessa solenidade.
Bom, boa tarde a todas e a todos, né? Eu quero registrar, inicialmente, os meus cumprimentos às autoridades presentes, em especial a doutora Heather Cameron, excelentíssima cônsul-geral do Canadá, a doutora Laura Rooney, excelentíssima analista sênior do Centro de Políticas para Questões de Vítimas do Departamento de Justiça do Canadá, bem como a doutora Larissa Muniz, que vem já há muito desenvolvendo um brilhante trabalho na área da justiça restaurativa. Se me permitem, eu sempre chamo ela com carinho muito grande, digo assim que ela é minha juíza predileta, minha juíza favorita. Ela integra o Comitê Gestor de Mediação Judicial da Justiça Restaurativa do Núcleo Permanente de Métodos Consensuais de Solução de Conflitos desse tribunal. Do mesmo modo, eu quero dedicar aqui meu especial agradecimento aos palestrantes de hoje. A doutora Catherine Bargen, doutor Aaron Lyons, que são referências na área da justiça restaurativa e reconhecidos internacionalmente há mais de 20 anos, tendo contribuído significativamente para o desenvolvimento dos métodos e também no acolhimento de diversas pessoas e comunidades. A presença de ambos é o que torna este evento desenvolvido de parceria com o Consulado do Canadá, em São Paulo, a melhor oportunidade para que fosse celebrada a parceria com a Associação da Justiça Restaurativa da província de Alberta. Um guia de recursos para líderes e profissionais, que agora estará ao alcance da realização concreta do tratamento de vítimas de crime, por meio do método da justiça restaurativa em nosso estado. A isso, eu parabenizo novamente a doutora Larissa pelo diálogo com o Instituto Mundo Melhor, entidade conveniada ao Tribunal de Justiça do Estado do Paraná e que promoverá a tradução do referido guia, e coloco à disposição espaço no site desta Corte de Justiça para a difusão desse nobre material. Como todos sabem, a justiça restaurativa ela possui um papel especial de destaque na solução de conflitos e violência por meio de princípios e métodos que preconizam a emancipação e autodeterminação de envolvidos. Bem, por isso, quando se fala em restaurar, se está, na verdade, recuperando. Estamos restaurando também, colocando em melhor estado aqueles envolvidos com práticas delitivas, bem como aqueles que suportaram o seu resultado de violência e dano. No espaço do direito penal, a Justiça Restaurativa oferece às vítimas uma resposta com tom e voz, em lugar apenas de um retorno com a punição do ofensor. No Brasil, a Justiça Restaurativa também tem se espalhado por outras searas. Por exemplo, no âmbito do direito da família, muito se tem discutido sobre os benefícios dos ciclos restaurativos para a identificação dos danos surgidos a partir de determinada relação familiar, suas respectivas obrigações e, finalmente, a melhor forma de resolução. E isso eu acrescento, por exemplo, naquelas situações de guarda, onde os pais acabam discutindo sobre o patrimônio chamado o troféu filhos. E essa justiça restaurativa, no círculo de paz, pode compor e trazer a responsabilidade dos pais para com os filhos. Da mesma forma, algo que me impressiona muito é o poder da justiça restaurativa na área dos adolescentes infratores. Porque você pode levar o adolescente infrator a ser recebido pela comunidade e pela família, porque você estará educando a família e educando o meio social em relação àquele adolescente. Você vai estar recuperando e restaurando a dignidade do adolescente. Da mesma forma, se nós formos observar que na violência doméstica contra a mulher, nós podemos utilizar também a justiça restaurativa, não para ensinar a mulher, mas quando aquele homem estiver recolhido, para que ele possa entender a capacidade que ele tem de respeitar o outro, ou seja, fazer com que o agressor, ele entenda que ao agredir a mulher, ele está autoagredindo todos, e ele precisa também se policiar, aprender que a agressão também é com ele, e que nós temos que respeitar o meio. Então, é necessário que nós possamos dedicar e estudar cada vez mais esses métodos restaurativos, para que com segurança e responsabilidade, o acolhimento, apoio e amparo a estas pessoas que tanto necessitam sejam concretizados. Esta é a tônica da atual gestão da segunda vice. Assim como no programa Justiça no Bairro, projeto de responsabilidade social que coordeno há mais de 19 anos, de promover uma justiça humanizada e com amor. Que possamos sempre seguir com essa missão, um bom evento para todos e todas, e que Deus abençoe cada um de vocês pelo trabalho extraordinário que estão desenvolvendo cada vez melhor.
Muito obrigada, desembargadora Justiça, pelas suas palavras. Passo agora a palavra à doutora Heather Cameron, cônsul-geral do Canadá.
Muito obrigada, boa tarde, good afternoon e bonjour. É uma honra de participar nesta abertura deste evento coordenado para a Vice-Presidência do Tribunal de Justiça no Estado de Paraná. Sobretudo porque hoje este Dia Internacional para a Eliminação da Violência contra as Mulheres. Tal qual o Dia Internacional de reconhecer a importância dos resultados justos e das novas estratégias e práticas para responder às necessidades das vítimas. Senhora doutora desembargadora Machado Camargo, segunda vice-presidência do Tribunal de Justiça do Paraná, agradecer a você e suas colegas pelo apoio fundamental do seu tribunal e suas equipes para realizar este evento. E mais que isso, por suas forças, pelo fortalecimento de uma parceria entre o Tribunal de Justiça do Paraná e o Canadá. E esperamos que vai continuar a crescer os anos que vêm. Há 2 anos agora, em 2019, que nossa equipe do Consulado organizou uma delegação brasileira para uma visita à província de Alberta, no Canadá, participar no simpósio anual de Justiça Restaurativa. Além de conhecer vários projetos canadenses desta área, como o Judiciário, o Governo Provincial e outros parceiros canadenses. Nesta ocasião, Sua Excelência a Justiça da Comarca Ponta Grossa, Dr. Larissa Angélica Copac Muniz, participou da delegação e dos resultados concretos desta visita oficial foi justamente a organização deste webinar com especialistas canadenses. Nossos especialistas, Catherine Bargen e Aaeron Lyons, da organização Just Outcomes, uma organização que apoia as comunidades e organizações, o desenvolvimento de relações justas, as ações e as situações criminosas ou nocivas. Catherine and Aaron, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your expertise with so many here in Brazil. It is very much appreciated by the Government of Canada. Compreendendo que todo o Judiciário do Estado do Paraná tem sido um importante protagonista na implantação de programas de justiça restaurativa no Brasil. Eu sei que a adoção de novas técnicas e metodologias que promovem uma cultura de paz e de reconstrução e de relações danificadas quer tempo e dedicação de trabalho de muitas pessoas. E por isso, parabenizo vocês. Também fico muito feliz de anunciar a tradução para português do guia canadense Servindo as Vítimas de Crime através da Justiça Restaurativa, uma guia de recursos para líderes e profissionais. E que esta guia foi organizada pela Associação de Justiça Restaurativa da Província de Alberta, com recursos do nosso Ministério de Justiça Federal no Canadá. Senhora Laura Rooney, oficial do Ministério de Justiça canadense, é conosco hoje e vai falar pouco sobre nesta guia. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have the Ministry of Justice with us today. Finalmente, eu gostaria de agradecer a todos vocês que participam neste curso e que estão implementando os programas de justiça restaurativa ao redor do Estado do Paraná e ao Brasil. Sinto-me honorada por Vossas Excelências terem selecionado o Canadá como seu parceiro nesta jornada. Bom evento, boas discussões, boa aprendizagem e muito obrigada pela oportunidade de acompanhar vocês em sua jornada. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada, doutora Heather Cameron, cônsul-geral do Canadá. Vou passar agora a leitura de um breve currículo dos nossos dois palestrantes, o Aaron e a Catherine, que eu tive a oportunidade de conhecer em Banff, no Canadá, e assistir a essa palestra que eles vão apresentar hoje, e sem dúvida nenhuma foi uma das que mais me chamaram a atenção. Então, para mim, Aaron e Catherine, é uma realização de um desejo antigo já, de poder proporcionar ao público brasileiro que estuda a justiça restaurativa essa fala de vocês dois. Então, a Catherine, eu vou passar só um momentinho. A Catherine Bargen tem trabalhado com comunidades para desenvolver programas de justiça restaurativa por mais de 20 anos. Sua liderança e experiência abrange trabalhos junto com o governo, organizações sem fins lucrativos, instituições educacionais, comunidades indígenas, grupos de serviços às vítimas, antiviolência e comunidades religiosas. Antes de ser a cofundadora da Just Outcomes, Catherine serviu por quase uma década como coordenadora da Justiça Restaurativa da Divisão de Serviços às Vítimas e Prevenção ao Crime do governo da Colômbia Britânica, no Canadá. Catherine possui mestrado em Transformação de Conflitos pelo Centro para a Justiça e Construção de Paz da Virgínia, nos Estados Unidos. Em 2019, foi homenageada com o Prêmio de Segurança Comunitária e Prevenção do Crime da Colômbia Britânica. Aaeron Lyons, também cofundador da Just Outcomes, é um experiente e apaixonado especialista em justiça restaurativa e construtor da paz. Com ampla experiência internacional em facilitação, consultoria, coaching e treinamento. Desde 2002, ele concebeu e liderou projetos inovadores em vários setores, desde comunidades do Ártico a Hong Kong, Brasil e Oriente Médio. O apoio de Aaeron a indivíduos, grupos e organizações é moldado por anos de experiência na linha de frente, trabalhando ao lado de pessoas impactadas e responsáveis por atos de violência. Entre vários currículos de treinamento, artigos e relatórios, Aaeron é coautor do célebre recurso Servindo as Vítimas do Crime através da Justiça Restaurativa, um guia de recursos para líderes e profissionais. Ele possui mestrado em Transformação de Conflitos pelo Centro para a Justiça e Construção de Paz, e esse, então, é o currículo dos nossos dois palestrantes, e também teremos a presença ilustre de Laura Rooney. A Laura trabalha no Ministério da Justiça do Canadá, e ela vai, num momento da fala também, conversar conosco. A Laura é analista sênior de políticas do Centro de Políticas para Questões de Vítimas do Departamento de Justiça do Canadá, e é responsável pelo trabalho de justiça restaurativa em sua unidade desde que começou a trabalhar no departamento em 2003. Antes disso, Laura concluiu seu mestrado em sociologia. Seu trabalho de tese focou nos jovens e na justiça restaurativa. Realmente vai ser uma tarde memorável para todos. E eu agora passo a palavra para Aaeron e Catherine para o início da nossa palestra.
Thank you so much for the warm greetings. I'm just being even here on the Zoom YouTube platform reminds me of being in Brazil with you all 10 years ago, where I had the opportunity to partake in the International Restorative Justice Conference going on at that time. So perhaps there are some of you on the call that I've met that are watching right now, and so pleased to be here. I'm joining you now from present-day Vancouver, Canada, which is the unceded Indigenous territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So happy to be here with my colleague Aaeron Lyons and Laura Rooney. We've all worked together in various ways for a long time, and it's very special to be here today. Our presentation today will consist of an overview of research around why restorative justice and victims' needs, and why restorative justice has so much potential to be a great fit for meeting their needs in a trauma-informed manner. We'll talk about the Listening Project and how it was created. Laura Rooney from the Department of Justice will be able to speak to that. Then we will talk about the results of the Listening Project, which spoke to the needs and experiences of victims of crime and how restorative justice was or wasn't able to meet those needs. Overall, we thought restorative justice did very well. And then recommendations of advancing restorative justice, how the movement can even better attend to the needs of victims and survivors. So over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to those who have put so much work and energy into organizing this event. We're very privileged to be with you today to speak about this important topic. I think if there's one thing that I'm hoping you will take away from this presentation, It's to emerge with a sense of restorative justice as a service for crime victims, and not as instruments for offender growth, rehabilitation, wellness, or even for community safety, all of which are very important goals for the work of restorative justice. But centrally important, victims' role within justice, that they're central players and beneficiaries of a justice process in their own right. And that's the spirit in which we approach this presentation. We would like to begin this presentation by briefly exploring a story which will help us to introduce the topic of this sometimes fraught relationship between justice and healing for those who have survived trauma and victimization. So very shortly, we're going to be playing for you a short video, which fortunately is subtitled in Portuguese. We'll be introducing Robert Cito, who is a family survivor of homicide. 40 years ago, not long after Robert moved to Canada from China, Robert's sister, Suzanne, was murdered quite violently in a small community here in British Columbia. And after many years of his own journey and healing, Robert made the decision to access a service here in Canada to meet face-to-face with the man who took the life of his sister. And there is a national program here in Canada which allows for face-to-face dialogues and for other forms of communication to occur in cases of serious violence under the auspice of Corrections Canada. So I'll be showing you this video as we set up our topic for today to give you an insight into one person's experience.
He sat down and we started to talk just after the briefest of introductions. And what I wanted to tell him was the story of my life with my sister, and the story of someone who he didn't know, who he killed, murdered in a very brutal way. I wanted him to know what had been lost to me and my family. I needed that for myself, and I needed him to hear it. And that's what I did. And I talked for a very long time. I brought photos of my sister and my family. I told him the story of how she was not only my sister, but my best friend growing up and a mentor to me. How she was separated from the rest of our family when she was young, my parents being unable to immigrate to this country until she was older, and unable to reconnect with her until she was older, and so I only knew her when she was about 11. That separation, all that time, and my parents' sense of loss after not very many years with her, and not being around for her younger years. I told that whole story, and he listened, and that's what I needed him to do, and he understood, and I was deeply moved, and I wanted to hear his story. I needed to know what had caused him to be the way he was. Because I'm a teacher, I have an understanding that childhood experiences really deeply affect what happens to you as an adult. And I suspected that I would hear something quite traumatic. So he told me the story about his life and what it was like. And I heard some disturbing things from him. And he, at no point, however, made any excuses for his crime. He acknowledged that his child may not have been ideal at times, but he did what he did. He accepted responsibility for it. He was remorseful about what had happened. And when I was listening to him talk, I just had a sense of someone who had lived a very long time incarcerated, and through that, those years, had gradually began to change. And he talked about various points in his life where he was in complete despair, and he talked about points in his life when he understood more what had happened to him. He talked about his family, all the things that I needed to hear. And in the end of a whole day of talk, I saw him as a person. And that was the most important revelation to me, that here was someone who had committed the most terrible acts towards others. But I realized that he was not that person anymore. He had changed. And at the end, we cried. And it was an experience that changed him as it did me. Because before he had a limited ability to connect with my sister as a victim, now he understood. And because of that, I feel like I have had a tremendous impact on him as much as he's had on me. I had heard after that meeting that his attitude and his relationships were profoundly affected. And so that really gave me a sense of gratification that I had come to this meeting to be healed myself, and I was. But somehow I was able to do something that could change him in a positive direction also, and that I had the ability to do that. And that was just as powerful for me as the personal healing that I benefited from. Since that time, I've continued my connection with him. We've had 4 other meetings since then, and at each meeting there's been a growth in what I have learned about him and what he has learned about me. And now I see that my involvement is a contribution here to public safety, in some ways, if you want to look at that way, if he's ever released, that because of my connection, I know that he's going to be a different individual than if he had just been released without knowing me at all. And I understand that now, and I wouldn't have understood that before, but after all these meetings and many hours of conversation, there's no doubt in my mind that I've contributed tremendously towards his ability to reintegrate back into the community.
So as many of you know from your own experiences or those that you have relationships with, the experience of victimization, whether it's violence to a person or to a loved one or even to property, can be all encompassing in one's life. And it can destabilize the basic pillars of well-being that all of us need in our lives, pillars like our own autonomy, being able to have a sense of our control over our own lives, like being in connection with others and being able to trust those around us, and even a sense of meaning, that the world has certain order to it, or that it's a place where certain things can be expected. So trauma has a way of disrupting our relationships with ourselves, with others, and even with the world around us as a whole. Some people, of course, the journey of recovery is very distinct for each person. There's no one size fits all, but some people describe this journey as a gradual shift from certain experiences of trauma to certain recognizable experiences of healing. So in trauma, there's a feeling often of disempowerment, that one's own agency, one's own power, control has been taken away by the act of violence, by also the physical responses that we have, which we have no control over, of how we experience the trauma of that, and often too by the legal and justice process. So questions emerging like, what does this mean about me? And how could I have let this happen? Trauma also typically leads to a profound loss of connection, where we ask ourselves, who can I trust? The loss of trust with, of course, those who have harmed us, but also those who have failed to prevent the harm, and strangers or people in the public that we no longer know where they stand in relationship to us. And victimization and trauma also can be profoundly disordering on our sense of meaning, our narratives about the safety of the world, that the world is a place where there's fairness, that we can expect our safety to be intact or our rights to be honored by others. All of that can be thrown into disarray. So a crisis of faith. For some, it looks like, how can God or the creator or the universe let this happen if that force in the universe is something good? So those kinds of very deep questions. And often within this experience, there's a profound and pervading sense of shame. So while healing and recovery is a nonlinear process and is a personal journey, as I said, some people talk about a gradual shift towards kind of an opposing experience from these experiences of trauma, moving from a place of disempowerment to a place of honor and dignity, where we can be affirmed that we did the best we could, that my reactions are valid, that it's not my fault, and that I have choices over what will come next in my own path, that I feel a sense of restoration of autonomy and voice. A journey towards connection, where one begins to perhaps reestablish or build trust with others who can validate their experience and stand in a kind of solidarity with them as the survivor of the crime, and without judgment, being accepted as we are. And also true in many people's healing journey is a sense of restored meaning, where we find ways of trying to make sense of what happened. Not to forgive and forget, but to remember and to integrate the story of the trauma into a larger story of one's life, in which that difficult and shocking experience can take its place within a life-giving narrative that means something. And so people talk about restorying their experience and their lives. So sometimes, you know, a way of thinking about restorative justice is, how can a justice process contribute to that healing journey? How can it uplift the experience of honor and connection and renewed meaning for the survivor? We know for sure that many aspects of our current legal system, at least here in Canada, and I'm guessing elsewhere in Brazil, don't serve victims and survivors well. That instead they can act to re-traumatize by placing the burden of proof onto victims to tell their stories, to do that in ways that are unprotected and often are felt as involuntary. And if you're interested in more about this, you can read some of the work of Judith Lewis Herman, a specialist in trauma. Restorative justice is intended as an approach that would center the needs and the voices of those who have been victimized. Who has been harmed and what are their needs is the first question that restorative approaches ask. And so inherent in a restorative approach, in theory, is this ability to start really as a central starting place, the needs of survivors. Victim-centered is sometimes a language or a term that's used to describe restorative justice in theory, that the experience of victims serves as a kind of a focal point, as a starting point for the justice process. And to organize the essence of the interaction between all other participants. However, we also know that not all the time does restorative justice feel that way or look that way in practice. And our purpose here today, in part, is to shine a light on where restorative justice approaches have met with their promise to survivors and where they also have not. And this, you know, this quote by Judith Lewis Herman suggests that oftentimes globally, as this very important movement unfolds, we are falling short of our promise to survivors. And there's a significant research that backs up that suggestion. As one crime victim said in a research article, it was like minding your own business and getting hit by another driver and having to get out and help that driver, right? So it's in that context that we took on the listening project, and I think we'll speak to some of how Justice Canada envisioned this and dreamed this up, and also you know, Just Outcomes was thrilled to be a part of this because of our conviction that restorative justice can be a genuinely helpful service to survivors, but we need to pay close attention to what survivors themselves are saying they need and how their needs may or may not be met through these processes. So I'll hand it back to, I think, Lara.
Hi. Yes. I just want to say how pleased I am to be here to join all of you, and really grateful to Catherine and Aaron for the opportunity to be involved with this presentation, and so appreciate the very warm welcome that you have given me. And as was mentioned, I am a senior policy analyst at the Policy Center for Victim Issues at the Department of Justice Canada. And as Aaron mentioned, I'm just going to provide a little bit of information on the purpose of the project and background and why Justice Canada chose to undertake it and what we were looking to achieve. So as the slide shows, there were three really key goals for the Canadian listening project. We wanted to really hear directly from victims and survivors and victim service providers that have participated in restorative justice processes, and to hear sort of the spectrum of their experiences, the good ones and the not so good ones. And we were really interested in adding to the body of Canadian research on restorative justice by focusing on the experiences of victims and survivors as participants. This, as Aaron has said, there has been lots of sort of research on positive and negative experiences of victims of crime in these processes, and it was really important to us to try to build that research base here in Canada. And the third goal was really to promote collaboration between victim serving organizations and restorative justice programs and agencies across the country. That kind of relationship and collaboration varies program to program, province to province. And so it was something that was really important to us to try to really honor that and promote those relationship building opportunities through the project. So in terms of some of the details about our involvement in the project, the unit that I work in leads something called the Federal Victim Strategy, whose mandate is to give victims a more effective voice in the criminal justice system and to increase access to justice for victims and survivors of crime. And so I had the privilege of supporting the development of this project along with a colleague in our research and statistics division who led the work. So the Department of Justice Canada provided the funding, and it was through our research and statistics division that the project was sort of unfolded over time. As Aaron mentioned, we know that research has shown that participation in restorative justice processes can have varied outcomes for victims. And the majority of victims that participate, at least from a victim satisfaction point of view, the research shows that the majority of victims are satisfied with their experience. And many of those research papers and research projects involved comparison groups with victims that went through the traditional criminal justice process. So there's this kind of overarching picture that victims are more satisfied when they participate in a restorative justice process than in the traditional criminal justice process. Generally speaking, as Aaron mentioned, participation can increase access to justice for victims and survivors. They, as the gentleman in the video really clearly showed, victims can receive answers to questions and speak about the impact of the crime on their lives. And participation can really contribute to recovery, healing, and closure for victims. But we also know that this isn't always the experience for victims, and some are left feeling re-victimized. They may have felt pressure to participate, or they may have been discouraged from expressing the real emotions that they were feeling. As Aaron mentioned, the process can be much more focused on accused or offender needs, and there may not be sort of the genuine involvement and expression of remorse that a victim is looking for from the accused or offender. So there are lots of ways in which a process cannot be a satisfying experience at all for victims, and may even be re-victimizing for them. So for these reasons and others, we really wanted to have the opportunity to hear directly from victims about their experiences with restorative justice. This isn't something that is easily accomplished, at least in Canada. There is often concern about speaking with victims about their experiences for fear of re-traumatizing them. And so we're always very cautious about that. But it is important to understand and raise awareness about the needs of victims and survivors and the benefits and challenges that they might encounter with respect to restorative justice. So there is some, greater background to this work. We were sort of the innovators of it between sort of 1999 and 2002. There were researchers in the United States that undertook a listening project. And the goal of that work was to hear the voices of victims and their advocates about specific concerns they had with restorative justice, to help inform the future development and implementation of restorative justice programs and processes. At that time, there was tension, quite a bit of tension between the victim survivor and restorative justice movements. And the victim and survivor community did not feel that it had adequate representation and voice in restorative justice processes. And that was also a very common experience in Canada. Since that time, the restorative justice movement has grown, and the Policy Center for Victim Issues has sought to raise awareness about the needs of victims and survivors, and to support capacity building among those that work in the field of restorative justice to more effectively engage and support victims that choose to participate in these processes. So that was sort of the foundation for why the Department of Justice reached out to and were happy to work with and partner with Just Outcomes to undertake a similar listening project to what was done in the United States. One of the key differences for us was that it wasn't simply an opportunity for victim and survivor groups to present critiques of restorative justice processes, though that was really, really important to us. But we also wanted to attempt to understand both their positive experiences, to understand the views and experiences with and thoughts that they had about restorative justice, and particularly, for our Canadian context. This type of conversation had really not taken place in Canada on a national scale. And so there were 5 communities that from across the country that participated with us in this project, and Just Outcomes worked very closely with them, that offered different restorative justice experiences. And they were sort of in different parts of the country, some more urban, some less so. And so we really wanted to sort of have a cross spectrum look at the different experiences that victims actually had. And so I guess the really key piece of that is that it was presented in such a way, in a very kind of restorative approach, as part of sort of the methodology, that victims were brought together with service providers, and Aaron and Catherine facilitated those sessions with the presence of those organizations that participated with us. They worked very closely with them to identify victims and survivors that might be willing to participate. And they were all brought together with a very open kind of dialogue to learn what were their thoughts, what were their experiences, what were the things that benefited them, and what were the things that, if they could see changed, they would recommend. So I'll turn it back to Catherine and Aaron to provide an overview of the methodology and some of the key results. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lara. Yeah, as Lara said, I had the privilege of being in all 5 sessions across Canada, listening to the victims of crime. And Aaron was in many of those as well, along with another colleague that we work with. And the types of crimes ranged from theft to the murder of a loved one. So there was quite a range, and there was about 36 crime survivors who participated across the country. I do just want to quickly qualify here that None of the sessions included victims of domestic violence or sexual assault, though many of the needs expressed may indeed be relevant to addressing that kind of trauma. Excuse me. I'm going to put the, I don't know if the audience will be able to see this, but in the chat is the link to the report that I'll be speaking to now. You could also access this report if you Google Canada crime victims experiences of restorative justice, a listening project. So anything that isn't covered in this presentation, you can find this report on the Department of Justice website. So what did we hear from survivors about what their needs are? Well, to start with, we know that many of them said at the very beginning that what they needed was support. They had a desire for reliable, trustworthy, and non-judgmental support in the aftermath of crime. Many experienced isolation from those around them after being victimized. One participant noted after the crime, support would help, but I didn't know exactly what that would look like. Family, extended family, friends, they're not equipped to listen well or to give good advice. Sometimes these folks are not the best support as they're offering need. Was another need that was expressed, and that's so commonly expressed by victims and survivors of crime, is information. So what they want to know is what happened, what the details of the offense, especially when the offense was committed against a loved one. Someone said, "I felt so incomplete when I only had pieces of a picture." They often want to know information about the person responsible for the crime. It could include information, like you heard that in Robert's story. He really wanted to better understand his background and ask questions like, how could you do this? What were you thinking? One participant reflected that they knew that they were unlikely to learn anything about the offender through the criminal justice system. And then there's the information that crime survivors need about justice system and options for achieving justice. We heard folks say that they often felt left in the dark and left to their own devices to navigate their situation, that they were not being listened to by system professionals and unaware of how to connect with or who to connect with. Restorative justice, they said, was satisfying to a lot of folks. They felt like they had someone to help them through the system. But there was some disappointment as well. Some felt like once the restorative justice process was done, they just didn't hear anything further about how offenders, people who've caused harm, how they were doing in their agreements. So this created a lot of surprise too for some of the folks attending these listening sessions were victim service specialists. And I recall one of them saying, "We have 40 years of research on what victims of crime need, information, yet so few people in the listening sessions had the information they needed." So in general, restorative justice really helped with that, but sometimes not always. So that was good to hear on both sides so that we can learn. I also want to note that while there were critiques of the criminal legal system in Canada here for victims and survivors, this was more about how the system was structured. There was acknowledgement that often independent people, individuals within the system, are often trying to do their best to meet people's needs, but the system is often not well set up to meet those needs. Another need we heard loud and clear was for crime survivors to be validated and vindicated. The need for something to be done, that somehow what they had gone through would have a meaning, and that their experience could be validated. As one participant said, who lost his beloved uncle in a distracted driving crash, he said he didn't feel that the criminal justice system was appropriately able to handle what he needed. For another, a deeply unsatisfying police response, perceptions of a revolving door, that the person who caused harm would not be held accountable or change their behavior. Restorative justice, those who went through restorative justice said that they feel they would have received nothing from the system with respect to the crime against them, but that restorative justice did give them some of what they needed there. On the other hand, some participants expressed uncertainty about whether the consequences for the offender were enough through their restorative justice experience. So that idea that restorative justice sometimes gets offenders through the system without ensuring meaningful accountability and behavioral change. Some saw a lot of effort by both the justice system and the restorative justice programs going towards the offender and their rehabilitation and their reintegrated efforts, but not as much efforts going towards them as those who've been harmed. Another need that some people expressed was wanting to make a difference for the offender. This is a really interesting case because some victim survivors express this for sure, but I sometimes find that some of us in the restorative justice field think this is the only reason to do restorative justice is to make that difference for the offender. But it was just one of many reasons. And for some, this was not the reason. But those for whom it was, they said they wanted to see the person who caused the harm to be transformed, not punished. They wanted to see it make a difference. Rehabilitation and reintegration goals were emphasized, especially in discussions around Indigenous and marginalized communities in light of the over-incarceration of these populations in Canada. So wanting to make sure that members of marginalized communities didn't suffer further at the hands of the criminal legal system. How did restorative justice do was that many were satisfied that the offender was doing much better since the restorative justice encounter, or that the offender was able to avoid just a punishment in the system, but rather do something meaningful. So another need that emerged through listening to victims' voices was that they want a chance to rebuild trust and safety. As Aaron explained earlier, the crisis of victimization can destroy or erode feelings of trust and safety in one's life and in one's community. They may feel betrayed by a lack of response during the crime and may have entered restorative justice in hope to be relieved from these feelings. Many crime victims want to feel like they know that they're not alone and that they haven't been abandoned by their communities. Some of them wanted to resolve their concerns about the offender's intentions. So they would say things like, I wanted, in those where they were living in a small town, they said, I wanted to be able to see them in the street and not feel scared. Or others said, I didn't know if this person who caused the harm was aggressive. So needing that sense of rebuilding their trust and safety in the world. There's a few quotes here that I'd invite you to read as well about how victims' realities change when a crime happens. Unfortunately, I don't have the English in front of me right now, so I can't read that for you. Restorative justice was shown to help rebuild that trust. It was especially in places where the survivor was able to attend with other community members. They found that the care, concern, and acknowledgement of community members in the process was experienced as meaningful. But some participants reported that, or victim advocates reported that some victims do not want to participate in restorative justice in the first place because they're still feeling so unsafe and they're not sure how to feel safer. So again, that comes to what we'll be talking about shortly about what restorative justice can do. I'm going to just review two more needs that emerged, and then we'll go to what we think restorative justice can do to advance and provide better service. One is reparation and compensation. Again, sometimes people think this might be all that crime victims want out of in the aftermath of crime, but it is so not the case usually that's the only thing, but it certainly can be a part of it. Sometimes it can be symbolic or material reparation. Symbolic reparations included hopes for the offender to perform work service toward the victim or to the community. They might want a letter of apology. They might want to see that person having their addiction treated, to engage in counseling, to participate in cultural or ceremonial activities or other things. Across the sessions, in all the sessions, there was a tension noted in that relationship surrounding the need for financial compensation. Some said that they did not initially identify financial compensation as a need, especially if there was no specific theft or property damage. But with support, they often felt empowered to acknowledge that need and accept an agreement containing financial reparations. One victim said, "It's hard for us to say what we want. No amount of money is going to fix our broken heart. It is a big risk to ask for what you want, but money is still something." As for how restorative justice did, many reported being satisfied, and there was a real appreciation to the restorative justice program in coordinating the restitution payments. So they had trust that the restorative justice program could help make those payments happen. But there was some disappointment surrounding reparation and financial compensation too. Sometimes if it was a young person, one victim remembers the young person saying, "You mean I have to pay it all back?" And she was distraught and maybe felt it was even unfair. And the victim survivor felt like she had to step into the role and say, it's okay. You don't have to pay me. Others felt like there was perhaps an agreement was made in the restorative justice process to repay, but they never did repay it in the agreement. So that was extremely disappointing to think that it would happen and then it didn't. A final need that we'll just discuss today before moving on, and there were other needs discussed in our final report. is voice and having choices. So having voice, having choice is so central for those who've experienced crime and been hurt in that way. Many participants wanted to have their voice heard by the offender. You might have noticed in the video from Robert, that was a prime motivator for him. He wanted his voice to be heard by the person who killed his sister, and he wanted to be a vehicle for bringing his sister's voice and life forward too. Some of them said, I wanted to convey emotion and I wanted to hear emotion. And generally there was little trust that talking about the impact would be appreciated by justice staff within the mainstream justice system. And they also felt sometimes that those close to them would not really hear what it was they needed to say. So they wanted to have choices on their process and decide how their voice would be heard and how their journey was expressed. Not surprisingly, we found that restorative justice did a pretty good job of making space for storytelling and expressing emotions. It was named as a real benefit to those who experienced crime and harm, to have input, to have their voice included in influencing the offender's reparation plans. Restorative justice strongly and favorably contrasted with other parts of the criminal justice system, which were often perceived to decide for victims what they may or may not need, and not giving them that voice or choice. But not everyone was satisfied. Some victims of crime said in restorative justice that they weren't asked how the crime affected them, and the focus was on assisting the offender in some of the restorative justice programs. So that was interesting to hear and shows us that we need to do better. So on that note, we want to talk about some ideas that this project, at least in Canada, provided for policy changes and practice changes for restorative justice to truly become meaningful, not just for those who caused harm, because of course that's centrally important as well, but sometimes the needs of those who've been harmed has been left behind. So here's a few ideas. Again, this is in the report that you can read. One of them, and I think if I had to name any one, I would name this one, which is providing a flexible process to provide, which is not easy in big systems, right? That is not easy in the big criminal legal system. But in restorative justice programs, there shouldn't be just a one size fits all. I'm not sure if that's an expression you use in Portuguese, but that instead of saying, here's the restorative justice program, you're going to just go through it, instead using a person-centered approach, moving away from that process-centered approach, but giving victims and survivors that opportunity to help shape and craft what it is they would like and how their voice and choices can be better reflected. And again, this isn't about saying they are the boss of everything and they decide, but that the restorative justice programs would really hear what would be meaningful, and also acknowledge that when victim and survivor needs are met in meaningful ways, that's often very good for the person who caused harm as well, because then they're invited into true and meaningful accountability. Another suggestion that we think should move forward after listening to so many victims of crime was that there would be better communication and messaging about restorative justice. We heard the victims of crime say that they would have appreciated clear visual aids, such as diagrams, and to see like how their case would be treated, and their place in the judicial process, that there would have been clearer messages. They also brought attention to the type of messaging restorative justice programs offer to victims and to referral sources. Several participants commented that their first impression of restorative justice, based on communication received through the system, such as law enforcement or even victim services and others, was that, would you like to participate in this program to help the offender, to help the person who caused you harm, and to help them avoid a criminal record and reduce their reoffending? And of course, well, for some, that was a good motivator. If it was a young person, maybe they did want to participate for that reason. But for many, that would be an immediate turnoff. Like, why would I want to participate in a program that's just for that? So better messaging becomes very important. Another important recommendation that we would have for restorative justice is to improve coordination with justice partners. And perhaps many of you who are involved in the justice system already, I have no doubt, do this very well. But that participants noted that restorative justice programs are operating both within and apart from the formal criminal legal system. And sometimes that makes for a bit of a confusing process for those experiencing harm. So accordingly, it was suggested that maybe there could be some better communication and coordination between the justice partners and at least in Canada, it's often community groups offering the restorative justice program. So just making a more seamless process for victims. Of course, that's always really hard to do in systems, but it is something to strive for. Another recommendation that emerged was to create better access for Indigenous folks. To maximize choice. One of the listening sessions that we did was specifically run by an Indigenous justice program. And what we heard is that within a justice system, particularly one that has been created generally by a colonial mindset, is that there's an opportunity, especially through restorative justice, to maximize choice for traditional ceremonies and rituals, and also may enhance participation for victims identifying as Indigenous, whereas perhaps in many circumstances, in victims who are Indigenous would not have a large reason to trust the system, but perhaps making it more culturally accessible to Indigenous victims and offenders would be useful. We know that Indigenous folks, at least in Canada, are disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of the justice system, and their rights for having options within the justice system need to be upheld. That's a United Nations Declaration for the rights of Indigenous people. There was also concern that police discretion in making referrals to the restorative justice program could be influenced by racist attitudes and therefore results in inequitable use of this discretion. So always having a lens and right now in Canada, we're being called, and rightly so, to put a reconciliation frame on all our systems. And this is one of the small ways that we owe it to do better for the Indigenous people that that live in the same spaces as us. Another need that we think could be addressed better within restorative justice, and therefore a recommendation is to expand financial support for restorative justice programs. Based on the challenge or tensions that victims may feel regarding compensation and financial supports, participants suggested that programs think more concretely about how to support victims in this manner. So pardon me, there's actually, I had said this financial support for restorative justice programs. Right now, I'm actually talking about financial supports for the victims of crime. One session I was in was so interesting. They spent a significant amount of time during their session talking about the idea of what they were calling, instead of a victim fund, they wanted to talk about a victory fund. And I see in Portuguese that's Fundo da Vitória, which was specifically about raising money for victims of crime within the restorative justice programs so that victims could access funds for all the costs they may incur to participate in the restorative justice program, such as babysitting or needing childcare, travel, time off work. So they were really wanting to see those barriers eliminated, and that restorative justice programs themselves could have funds for the victims and survivors that participate in their programs. Next, there's lots of little quotes here again that you can read, but enhancing and prioritizing support systems. Is this the right slide? I can't tell. I think that one's the voice one, Aaron. This one.
Which one do you need?
Enhancing and prioritizing support systems.
That's it.
That's it. Great. So they some recommendations here were also very creative about how within a restorative justice programs we can just help victims and survivors feel more at home. It could mean things like having therapy animals present for those who might want them. For some, they feel very secure by having police present, and for others, they feel more secure when police are not present. So, and then also having a list of programs that they might want to think about recommending for the offender, just giving them more supports, more options, and helping them feel that they have the resources they need to go through the program. The next slide talks about optimizing victims' participation and voice. So this is so incredibly critical, and it can happen in different aspects of the restorative justice program. For example, it can happen even in victim intake. So that can become very important for a restorative justice program. A simple telephone call asking if they would like to participate in a predetermined process was described as insufficient. Instead, restorative justice programs should actively demonstrate how its programming is tailored to the victim's care and support. So just an invitation saying, would you like to participate, wasn't always meaningful. Participants emphasize that they shouldn't as I mentioned earlier, there shouldn't be assumptions about why they may want to participate in a restorative justice program, such as helping out a youth who committed the offense, but instead being asked, you probably have some needs that have arisen from this crime. We'd love to talk to you about those needs and see how our program can help. And maybe that involves some input from the person who caused the harm, but let's figure it out and how it can be made safe for you. They really were emphasizing that they thought practitioners needed to be well informed, especially during the agreement phase. So again, if the person who caused harm was saying, I'll repay back $100 and I'll do 100 hours of community service, it was really helpful to participants to know that the facilitator could be well informed about what's realistic. So how are you going to be paying back that $100? What's your plan? These 100 hours of community service, that's a lot of time. What's the plan there? So optimizing that the victim's participation could truly be freed up to participate, so because the practitioner was in a place of doing the reality checks. There was also a feeling that optimizing their participation required rigorous case preparation, so that there was a lot of time given to victims and survivors before any meeting would happen. Or maybe it stopped there. Maybe it's not case preparation. Maybe it's about listening to the needs and referring them to a victim service program and stopping there, but that there would be time spent in advance with those harmed, that they wouldn't just show up at a dialogue process and have to speak for themselves suddenly. There's just a few more that I will go through, and then we will move on to some questions and answers. One of the recommendations would be to prioritize victim sensitivity training. So to making sure that that restorative justice practitioners have training in trauma and in understanding victim and survivor issues. Another one is to expand opportunities for victims to connect. So one of the things that I really found the most enjoyable parts of this project was the victims and survivors connecting to each other and hearing stories that sounded so familiar for them, and went a long way to meeting the needs they had around feeling validated, feeling like there were other people out there that could understand them and the journey they had been on. So that's a real interesting challenge that a restorative justice programs may want to explore, of how to allow victims and survivors who've been through their programs to connect with each other. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there needs to be sustained funding for restorative justice programs in order for victim needs to be meaningfully met. Here in Canada, sometimes programs only know they have 1 year of funding at a time, or they really only have one part-time person that can't meet the need of the community that they're in. So another strong recommendation that came out of this project was that victims and survivors themselves said they wanted to know that the program that they were working with had the funds it needed to work with them and support the resources that they might need. So that concludes what we learned through the listening project, and the exciting ways that restorative justice has the opportunity to advance in this time of great interest in restorative justice. And again, I would encourage you to read the report for yourself. For those, I don't think it's available in Portuguese yet, but for those who can speak English or want to put it into Google Translate, one paragraph at a time, you could take a look too. Obrigado. Thank you so much. I would like to make time now for question and answers, or Aaron and Laura, if you have anything more to add before we go into that time.
Thanks, Catherine. I just wanted to highlight the quote that's on the slide from the author Margaret Wheatley, saying that there's no, if I'm translating right from Portuguese, there's no power greater than a community of people discovering what it cares about. And we understand that you in Brazil and in your particular context are exploring these issues in new ways right now, and want to make sure that in doing so, we can provide whatever experiences and perspectives from Canada that will help you along the way as and where you are. And we continue to learn as well from you in Brazil based on all of the amazing work that's happening in your context. So yes, with that, we would love to receive any questions you have in what time remains.
Maybe I should just ask, is there someone we should be handing it over to at this point to facilitate the question and answer?
Eu posso ajudar agora. Tem algumas perguntas no chat aqui. Não sei se a desembargadora quer fazer alguma pergunta, alguma consideração. Desembargadora Justiça, não. A primeira pergunta é como é feita a busca ativa dessas vítimas, né? Ou elas procuram o programa?
And just to clarify, are we talking about during the listening project, or are we talking about in the restorative justice programs themselves?
Eu acho que dá para falar do projeto, né, que eles conduziram, como no projeto essas vítimas chegaram até eles.
Thanks for that clarification. That was probably one of the most challenging parts of the project. Once folks were in a room talking, it was quite straightforward and easy and rewarding. But finding programs to participate and then what we did was we asked the coordinator of the restorative justice program to reach out to people that they thought might be interested. We were relying on the fact that those program coordinators would have a relationship already with the victims and survivors that participated in their programs. So we, as the coordinators of the listening project, we sort of committed to stepping a bit back from actually reaching out to the victim survivors unless they wanted more information, we invited them to specifically talk to us. Otherwise, we relied on the coordinators of the victims of the restorative justice programs to invite folks that they thought might be suitable to participate in the listening project. And some of the sessions had like 12 people in them, and some had only 4, some of the more remote communities. So it was not always easy for people to give up their time to spend, but we also were able to build in, thankfully, thanks to Justice Canada, honorariums to help offset the costs of victim survivors attending a 5-hour session where we provided lunch as well. So,
I'll maybe just add that in case there's curiosity among the listeners about outreach to survivors through restorative justice programming, this is a question that we hear a lot. There's several practices that can help. One is that if there's a possibility of working through what we'll call a third party, so in other words, somebody who the survivor knows, who also knows the restorative justice program, Maybe it's a victim service professional, or maybe somebody else within the system, or even outside of the justice system that can provide that liaison and introduction between the program and the survivor. That can be very helpful as a step for the survivor to go in with some trust. And of course, that's not always possible. And depending on the severity and types of crime and the context in which we're working, some programs do outreach directly through phone calls or through letters. And it's just very important in those outreach, in those circumstances, that the communication be geared towards, as Catherine has said, not here is a rigid structure that we're inviting you into, but instead framed as restorative justice exists as a service intended to meet your needs. We would love to set up a time to meet with you where we can hear more about how you've been affected and what you might need going forward, and how, if at all, we may be of assistance. And so that type of framing that centers the victim's needs is really important as we contemplate the outreach process.
And maybe one more thing to add is that I believe Judge Larissa mentioned, or perhaps Judge Josie earlier, that the Serving Victims of Crime guide that is being translated into Portuguese has a lot of these very practical ways of reaching out and meeting the needs of victims and survivors in trauma-informed ways.
Can I just add something to that as well that I think might be relevant? So one of the things that was identified, and I think Catherine and Aaron have expressed this really effectively through the listening project results, is that there are programs that reach out to victims, and those workers are not always very comfortable in doing that. They don't really know how to do it effectively, and sometimes sort of stumble through that experience. And so, and that obviously can have some really unfortunate results for victims. Maybe they, as has been said, they choose not to participate, or they participate but already kind of go in with a little bit of a sense of uncertainty about the process. And so one of the provinces in Canada, the province of Saskatchewan, really wanted to support their workers and restorative justice practitioners in the province to find better ways of engaging sort of at the very front end. How do we do that well? And so they designed a victim engagement training that the Department of Justice Canada was able to provide funding for, to really provide that support and very practical, intended to be very practical support to groups that are working with victims and reaching out to them. So like the very finite part of reaching out, that first kind of outreach. So anyway, I just thought that I would share that.
Muito obrigada pela resposta. Isso é uma preocupação grande aqui. Ponta Grossa tem sistema de apoio à vítima, projeto de apoio a vítimas, e nós demoramos muito tempo para conseguir trazer as vítimas. As vítimas, elas não querem estar no sistema de justiça, porque para elas aquele lugar é de quem cometeu o crime, não delas. E nós demoramos muito, tentativa e erro, até entendermos isso. E agora eu queria fazer uma pergunta, porque aqui o que funcionou é, primeiro, uma aproximação individual, onde o facilitador conversa com essa vítima e depois, muito tempo depois, é oferecido a ela participar de um grupo com outras pessoas que são vítimas também. Eu gostaria de saber se esse projeto de vocês, se ele faz esse movimento individual, ou já são grupos onde a pessoa pode falar e ouvir outras vítimas. Como é que isso, na prática, né? Como é que funciona esse movimento?
I think so. I really am intrigued by this question. And Aaron and Lara, correct me if I'm wrong here, but unless I'm unaware of certain restorative justice programs that would sort of connect through a group, the initial contact is always individual, reaching out individually to the person to find out what interest they may have in participating in a restorative justice program, how that restorative justice program operates and could be tailored to meet their needs, if at all. If it's a robust restorative justice program, it will create spaces and opportunities for the process to be flexible towards them. And then that one-on-one interaction continues until such a time as the victim or the survivor decides, yes, I would like to perhaps participate in a dialogue with the person who caused me harm, or perhaps they want to participate in a circle of support of some other kind. Or perhaps there are a few programs that offer what's called victim surrogate programs. So sometimes that's for the offender. They bring in a surrogate to speak for the victim on behalf of the victim, that the victim could, again, in robust programs, request something like that. Or perhaps the victim or survivor would like to meet with a surrogate offender or person who caused harm. So the process, and there may be many processes I'm not aware of or understand, but generally is about that time of connecting individually with a victim, or perhaps a family, like it might be 2 or 3 people if they experienced the same harm and are all interested. But it's usually individualized to begin with and to understand and assess the needs, and then it goes out from there to think, okay, now how can we meet those needs?
I think the kind of flexibility and tailored process that Catherine's speaking about is very important. And I also want to affirm, Judge Larissa, what you're speaking about in the construction of this approach, because it is rare that restorative justice programs here in Canada have the capacity to bring together a survivor support circle. And it is happening in a few programs that have explicitly made it their goal to attend to victims' needs as important parts of the justice process, or as a central part, but it's not the norm. And in fact, what's more common is that restorative justice programs would have developed such a mechanism for the people who caused harm and their support people, which mimics the offender orientation of the justice system. But if you're doing something in your system that centers victims in that way as an option for them that they can choose to opt into, that seems like a really positive thing that we in Canada could learn a lot from. So thank you for sharing that.
Obrigada. Eu acho que a Dina pediu para falar agora ao final. Dina, você está aí? Are you there?
Estou aqui. I am here. Boa tarde a todos. Meu nome é Dina, embora pareça Carolina, que é minha filha, do qual o computador que eu estou utilizando. Mas eu queria só apenas dar algumas palavras da Associação de Justiça Restaurativa de Alberta, que pediu esse guia, que vai ser traduzido, que eles têm algumas palavras só para compartilhar com vocês. Eu prometi que eu faria essa para eles. Voltando, desculpa para minha apresentação, eu trabalho no Consulado do Canadá. Eu trabalho com esse programa de justiça restaurativa, essa cooperação Brasil-Canadá, por mais de 10 anos. Então, é um prazer estar com vocês hoje E agradeço muito nossos palestrantes canadenses e nossos queridos parceiros de Paraná e de todo o Brasil, para essa empreitada que estamos fazendo junto. E agora as palavras da associação. A Associação de Justiça Restaurativa de Alberta está muito contente em cooperar com o Tribunal de Justiça do Estado de Paraná para melhor servir as vítimas de crime através da tradução de nosso guia para líderes e facilitadores. Esperamos que esta iniciativa é a caminho de comunidades mais seguras para suas comunidades e para o mundo. E essa foi falado de Jan Moran, que é a diretora executiva dessa associação. Então, eu queria só compartilhar isso com você. E só um aviso também, temos apenas 13 minutos até a tradução vai acabar, então só para ter essa ciência, tá bom? Muito obrigada.
Bem, então as perguntas já foram feitas, vamos para o encerramento, e aí com esse aviso da Dina, que temos apenas agora 12 minutos, né? Então eu gostaria de agradecer o aprendizado dessa tarde, agradecer imensamente a Catherine, Laura e ao Aaron, e dizer que esse é um início da nossa trajetória pós-pandemia. Já estamos pensando, e a desembargadora Joyce me contou, a assessora dela me contou que já recebeu o sinal verde para pensarmos num evento para lançarmos o manual traduzido para o português. Isso ficará pronto em fevereiro de 2022 e vamos começar a pensar nisso. Então, desejo uma boa tarde a todos. Deixo a palavra agora, desembargador, não sei se quer dar um tchauzinho, e depois aos nossos palestrantes, né? E, desembargador.
Eu só quero agradecer esta oportunidade, e nós percebemos pela fala de todos que as dificuldades existem, mas ninguém desiste daquilo que é recompor, que é restaurar e que é facilitar a vida. Que todos que estão aqui pensam da mesma forma. E acredito que nós devemos estreitar, acho que é salutar estreitar nossos relacionamentos para um aprendizado comum. Vemos as nossas dificuldades, aprendemos e também trocar ideias, que é o mais importante, porque assim é um crescimento. Então, eu agradeço muito, obrigada, Consul, obrigada a Carolina, a todos, o Aaron, a Catherine, e Deus abençoe a todos, estamos aqui sempre à disposição. Beijo no seu coração, Larissa.
Então, Aaron ou Catherine ou Laura querem dar um tchau? Ou, se não, nós encerramos por aqui.
Just again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you. Such a warm welcome, and we're so pleased to be with you in this way. Thank you so much for the invitation, and bless you.
Agreed. I want to thank you as well, and it's always something that we look forward to at any opportunity, is to be in a room, even if it's a virtual room, with a group of Brazilian people. We've had so many wonderful interactions over the years, and always are so inspired by what we see you doing and the spirit in which you're doing it. So thank you for this opportunity, and we look forward to more building of this relationship.
And
Laura, a few last words?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to say it's been an honor to join with you this afternoon, and just express how gratifying it is that some of the work that the Department of Justice Canada has been able to support through funding or research or other things is being used to kind of benefit beyond our borders. So that's just really exciting, and I'll look forward to sharing that with colleagues of mine in our programs branch and other parts of our department. So thank you very much for allowing me to join with you this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Doutora Larissa, algumas palavras finais? Então, eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos e todas, agradecer nossos parceiros canadenses maravilhosos que sempre estão conosco nessa empreitada de divulgar, compartilhar a experiência que eles fizeram lá no Canadá e principalmente em prol da vítima, né? De ter esse enfoque, cuidado, esse olhar e esse cuidado com as pessoas que sofrem mais de crimes e tem esse dano que eles carregam. E para o Consulado do Governo do Canadá é um prazer fazer essa ligação, que essa ponte cresça. Esperamos que fortalecem ainda mais esses laços que já criamos. E dentro do chat eu compartilhei um e-mail. Qualquer dúvida que não foi esclarecido, por favor, pode enviar um e-mail para esse endereço que responderei. E essa gravação está sendo gravada, essa sessão, e estará compartilhado com todos no canal Larissa do Segunda Vice-Presidência, e tem outro, né?
Isso, canal da Segunda Vice-Presidência e do Sejusc de Ponta Grossa também vamos replicar.
Perfeito. Então, podem acessar, então, e compartilhar após o evento. Muito obrigada. Então, encerrada o evento? Tchau a todos.